They sang about whiskey, heartbreak, and lonely nights. But for some country legends, the bottle wasn't just part of the music, it became part of their lives. Behind the sold-out shows and roaring applause were arrests, ruined marriages, missed performances, and private battles few fans truly understood. Some survived and changed. Others never escaped. Today, we're counting down 11 country music icons who were drunk all the time, and the painful price many of them paid. 11. Tanya Tucker. Long before country music embraced rebellious women with attitude, edge, and scars to prove they had lived, Tanya Tucker had already done it. She was barely a teenager when fame found her, exploding onto the scene in the early 1970s with a voice far older than her years and a confidence that made Nashville pay attention. While most girls her age were worried about school dances and homework, Tanya was standing under spotlights, singing songs about pain, desire, and heartbreak, like someone who had lived 3 lifetimes. America was fascinated. A child with the voice of a grown woman was rare enough, but a child star with that much fire was something else entirely. But early fame often comes with a hidden cost, and Tanya Tucker would spend years paying it. As her career grew, so did the pressure. Touring schedules, media attention, industry expectations, and constant scrutiny created a world where adulthood arrived far too early. By the time many artists are still finding their sound, Tanya was already a veteran of the spotlight. She was famous, wealthy, recognizable everywhere, and emotionally carrying burdens most young people never have to face. In country music, where nightlife and drinking culture were woven into the fabric of the business, alcohol was always nearby. Backstage bars, late-night parties, after-show celebrations, and circles full of excess became normal. For Tanya, that world became dangerous. Throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, stories of heavy partying followed her almost as often as her hit records did. She developed a public image that mixed glamour, chaos, romance, and unpredictability. Her highly publicized relationship with Glenn Campbell only intensified the headlines. Together they were magnetic, messy, and constantly watched. Their romance brought endless media attention, but behind the scenes, both were dealing with personal struggles, including substance abuse and alcohol. What fans saw as celebrity drama was often something darker, 2 stars trying to survive their own storms. And yet, Tanya never completely disappeared. That is what makes her story different from so many others on this list. While alcohol and reckless years damaged parts of her life and reputation, they never fully destroyed her talent. Even during turbulent times, she remained one of country music's most recognizable voices. She continued recording, continued performing, and continued fighting through periods when many assumed her best years were over. Then came the comeback few expected. Later in life, Tanya Tucker returned not as a nostalgia act, but as a respected survivor, older, wiser, and carrying the hard-earned truth of everything she had lived through. She reintroduced herself to a new generation. Critics praised her honesty, fans admired her resilience, and younger artists saw her as a blueprint for endurance. Tanya Tucker's story is not simply about drinking too much. It is about what happens when fame comes too early, freedom arrives without protection, and pain hides behind applause. Many stars on this list were swallowed by the bottle. Tanya was one of the rare ones who stared it down, stumbled badly, but found a way to keep singing. Number 10. Mindy McCready. When Mindy McCready first arrived in country music, she looked like the next great star Nashville had been waiting for. Young, charismatic, beautiful, and blessed with a voice that could sound playful one moment and devastatingly emotional the next, she quickly captured attention in the mid-1990s. Her debut success came fast, and for a moment it seemed obvious she was headed toward a long run at the top. Radio loved her sound, fans loved her energy, and the industry saw major commercial potential. But some careers collapse long before the public understands why. Behind the hit songs and magazine covers was a woman struggling with pressure, emotional instability, and a growing relationship with alcohol that would become impossible to ignore. Fame can magnify pain, and in Mindy's case, it often seemed to expose wounds that had never healed. The higher her profile rose, the more chaotic her private life became. Headlines that once celebrated a promising new country star slowly transformed into stories of legal trouble, volatile relationships, arrests, rehab attempts, and personal crises. For viewers looking back now, the tragedy is how predictable it all became. Country music has always sung openly about drinking, bars, whiskey, regret, heartbreak. But for some artists, alcohol stops being part of the soundtrack and becomes part of survival. In Mindy's life, drinking appeared less like celebration and more like escape. Public appearances sometimes reflected that instability, and insiders frequently described a talented artist unable to find peace once the cameras turned off. Her relationships also became front-page material. Highly publicized romances, domestic disputes, custody battles, and emotional breakdowns kept her name in tabloids almost constantly. The music became secondary to the chaos, which is often how careers die in entertainment. Once the audience begins seeing scandal before talent, it becomes brutally hard to reverse. And yet, through it all, the voice never disappeared. That is one of the saddest parts of Mindy McCready's story. Even during her most troubled years, she could still sing with startling power. There were moments when interviews or performances reminded everyone what had once made her such a rising force. You could hear the star she was supposed to become. But talent alone cannot defeat addiction, trauma, or untreated pain. As the years passed, the crises deepened. Rehab stints, legal issues, emotional distress, and recurring instability painted the portrait of someone fighting battles far larger than the public understood. Many watched from a distance, some judged, some sympathized, but very few truly knew how severe the struggle had become. In 2013, Mindy McCready died at just 37 years old. Her death stunned fans, but also felt like the heartbreaking final chapter of a long, public unraveling. Mindy's story is not simply about alcohol. It is about how quickly promise can turn into pain when fame meets vulnerability. She had the looks, the voice, the hits, and the opportunity many artists dream of. But behind the success was a person drowning in battles no chart position could fix. Some stars fade quietly. Mindy McCready faded in full view of the world, and that may be the cruelest tragedy of all. 9. David Allan Coe. If country music ever produced a man who seemed born for chaos, it was David Allan Coe. While many Nashville stars polished their image, smiled for cameras, and carefully protected their careers, Coe built his reputation by doing the exact opposite. He looked dangerous, sounded dangerous, and often lived as if rules were made for everyone else. Long hair, tattoos, outlaw swagger, biker culture, prison stories, controversy, and a lifetime of refusing respectability turned him into one of the most polarizing figures country music had ever seen. And alcohol was never far from the picture. Coe rose during the era when outlaw country was challenging Nashville's clean-cut machine. Artists like Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson pushed against the system musically, but David Allan Coe took rebellion into something far rougher. He cultivated an image of bars, road life, excess, and danger. Fans loved him because he felt real, or at least more real than the polished stars coming out of Music Row. But living like an outlaw sounds better in songs than it does in real life. Heavy drinking became part of the mythology surrounding Coe. Stories of backstage chaos, long nights, confrontations, unpredictable behavior, and a life built around the next show and the next bottle helped create his legend. In some circles, it increased his appeal. To many fans, Coe was the last man in country music who truly did not care what anyone thought. But the same habits that build legend can slowly destroy discipline. Unlike artists who hid their flaws, Coe often seemed to wear them proudly. That made him fascinating and dangerous to himself. The road lifestyle of constant touring, late-night bars, rough company, and endless temptation has broken countless performers. For Coe, it became a permanent environment. Drinking was not an occasional vice. It was woven into the persona people expected from him. The wild man had to remain wild. And once an audience starts rewarding self-destruction, escaping it becomes even harder. Yet through the controversy, there was undeniable talent. David Allan Coe could write. He could command a stage. He could sing with grit, humor, menace, or heartbreak depending on the moment. Songs like You Never Even Called Me By My Name made him unforgettable, but many in the industry believed he was capable of even more had his life been less chaotic. That may be the central theme of his story. Massive ability repeatedly overshadowed by self-created storms. He also became notorious for offensive material and career-damaging decisions that alienated parts of the public. Combined with his drinking-fueled reputation, it left him both admired and condemned. Some saw authenticity. Others saw recklessness. David Allan Coe's story is not the tragedy of a man who lost everything overnight. It is the slower story of someone who turned instability into identity and paid the price over decades. He survived where others collapsed, but survival is not the same as peace. Some country stars sang about the outlaw life. David Allan Coe lived it so fully that separating the man from the bottle became nearly impossible. Number 8. Johnny Paycheck. Few names in country music history fit this topic more naturally than Johnny Paycheck. Even his stage name sounded like a man built for smoky bars, broken neon signs, and nights that ended badly. He was loud, rough-edged, rebellious, and carried the kind of hard-living energy that country audiences instantly recognized. Long before personal chaos became a marketing tool, Johnny Paycheck was already living it in real time. And for much of that life, alcohol was a constant companion. Born Donald Lytle, he entered the music business young and worked around legends before becoming one himself. He played bass for major acts, learned the business from the inside, and eventually emerged as a star in his own right. By the 1970s, Paycheck had become one of the most recognizable outlaw-style voices in country music. He could sound angry, wounded, sarcastic, or defiant in the same song. That emotional volatility made him compelling, and also mirrored the turbulence of his private life. Then came the anthem that defined him forever. Take This Job and Shove It became one of country music's most iconic working-class rebellion songs. It turned Johnny Paycheck into a household name and cemented his image as a blue-collar antihero who said what ordinary people wished they could say. But while fans saw a fearless truth-teller, the man behind the microphone was increasingly sinking into destructive habits. Heavy drinking, drug use, financial problems, and erratic behavior began shaping his life as much as his music did. The road can be merciless for unstable personalities. Endless touring means no routine, constant temptation, late nights, and crowds that reward excess. For Paycheck, that world became fuel for self-destruction. Stories followed him everywhere. Fights, missed obligations, unpredictable moods, reckless spending, and behavior that made promoters nervous. In country music, wildness can build mystique for a while. Eventually, it just becomes expensive chaos. His legal troubles pushed things even further. In the 1980s, Johnny Paycheck was convicted after a shooting incident at a bar, a shocking episode that turned a troubled reputation into national news. For many artists, scandal damages image. For Paycheck, it confirmed what people already suspected. The outlaw persona was not an act. He was living inside it. But authenticity can be brutal when it comes without control. Despite everything, Paycheck's talent remained undeniable. His voice had raw grit that no polished singer could fake. He sounded like regret, anger, and whiskey all at once. Fans who loved traditional country often forgave him because he felt real in a genre that sometimes drifted towards slick commercialism. Even when his career declined, the respect for his recordings never fully disappeared. Yet the decline was painful. Financial hardship, health issues, prison time, and years of instability left scars no hit song could erase. While some stars reinvent themselves after chaos, Johnny Paycheck never fully escaped the life that made him famous. His story is the classic country contradiction. A man whose flaws helped create his legend, then slowly consumed it. The same fire that made audiences love him also burned through relationships, opportunities, and peace of mind. Some artists borrow the outlaw image for career advantage. Johnny Paycheck lived it until there was almost nothing left to separate the myth from the damage. Number 7. Merle Haggard. Merle Haggard was never supposed to become a legend. He was born into hardship, raised in struggle, drifted into crime as a young man, and spent time behind bars before most future stars have even found direction. By every ordinary standard, his story should have ended early and badly. Instead, he transformed pain into one of the greatest careers country music has ever seen. His songs spoke for workers, wanderers, the proud, the broken, and people who rarely saw themselves represented in polished entertainment. But greatness does not erase inner battles. Unlike some names on this list, Merle Haggard was not known purely as a drunken wreck spiraling in public. His story is more complex, and in many ways more human. Alcohol and substance use were part of his world for years, woven into touring life, backstage culture, emotional pressure, and the rough environment surrounding country music in the era he rose through. He lived hard, played hard, and at times numbed himself the same way many men of his generation did, through the bottle. The difference was that Haggard could hide pain behind discipline. That is what made him unique. While other stars collapsed loudly, Merle often kept functioning at a high level. He wrote masterpieces, toured relentlessly, recorded hit after hit, and maintained the image of a rugged survivor. But beneath that productivity were years of personal strain, emotional scars, failed marriages, and habits that were not always healthy. Many artists self-destruct publicly. Others do it quietly while still showing up for work. Haggard knew loneliness intimately. Songs like Misery and Gin did not feel imagined. They felt lived. He could sing about regret, bars, lost love, and self-inflicted damage with a realism that only comes from experience. Fans heard truth in his voice because he understood the men sitting alone in taverns at midnight. He understood the pride that keeps people silent and the drink that often replaces honest conversation. His early life helps explain much of it. The death of his father when Merle was young deeply affected him. Rebellion followed. So did juvenile trouble, incarceration, and years of carrying the identity of an outsider. Even after success arrived, many artists never truly leave their old wounds behind. Fame changes surroundings, but it does not automatically heal history. For Haggard, success brought money and admiration, but not immunity from pain. Yet he endured longer than most. That endurance is why Merle Haggard belongs on this list. Alcohol damaged many stars quickly. With Haggard, it became part of a decades-long life of coping, surviving, and carrying burdens while still creating extraordinary art. He matured over time, reflected on mistakes, and grew into an elder statesman of country music. Older Merle often seemed wiser, calmer, more introspective than the younger man who once lived closer to the edge. Still, the marks remained. His story reminds us that not every battle with alcohol ends in scandal, arrest, or sensational collapse. Sometimes it exists in the quieter corners of a life, inside loneliness, sleepless nights, strained relationships, and habits that slowly become normal. Merle Haggard did not become great because of the bottle. He became great despite it. And that distinction says everything. Number 6. Waylon Jennings. Waylon Jennings looked like freedom. The beard, the leather, the deep voice, the swagger. He carried himself like a man who answered to nobody. At a time when Nashville often preferred polished smiles and carefully controlled stars, Waylon represented something rougher and far more dangerous. He was one of the faces of outlaw country, the movement that challenged the industry machine and gave artists control over their own sound. Fans didn't just admire him, they believed him. And for many years, the lifestyle matched the image. Waylon came from humble beginnings in Texas, working radio and playing music long before fame arrived. His life changed forever after he briefly played bass for Buddy Holly and narrowly avoided being on the doomed flight that killed Holly in 1959. That trauma stayed with him for decades. Survivors often carry invisible weight, and for Waylon, pain and guilt became part of the emotional foundation beneath the success that followed. As his career exploded in the 1970s, so did the excess surrounding it. Touring money, fame, late nights, endless road miles, and an entourage culture built for temptation created the perfect storm. Waylon became known for heavy drinking and hard living, part of a larger outlaw scene where rules were meant to be broken. Fans loved the rebellious image, and the industry could profit from it. But what audiences celebrate from a distance can become poison up close. Though cocaine became one of the biggest demons of his life, alcohol was never separate from the chaos. Drinking was part of the rhythm. After shows, before shows, backstage, on the bus, in hotel rooms, during the endless cycle of road life. It blurred judgment, intensified other addictions, and helped sustain a pace no human being can keep forever. Like many stars, Waylon was praised for living wild while privately paying for it. His marriage to Jessie Coulter became one of the great country love stories, but even that relationship was tested by addiction and instability. Loving someone trapped in fame-fueled self-destruction can feel like loving two different people. The genius and the wreckage. Jessie stood by him through years many would not have survived, and yet Waylon did survive. That is what separates his story from so many tragedies. By the mid-1980s, after health warnings and years of chaos, he began making real changes. He got sober from drugs, cut back destructive habits, and rebuilt himself. The older Waylon who emerged was still tough, still authentic, but far more grounded than the man who once seemed determined to burn through everything. His music gained even deeper meaning because listeners knew what he had overcome. Songs about regret, independence, mistakes, and redemption hit differently when sung by someone who had actually lived them. Still, the damage of earlier years never disappears completely. Health struggles followed him later in life, and the physical toll of decades of excess was real. Waylon Jennings' story is the perfect outlaw country paradox. The same rebellion that made him iconic nearly destroyed him. He gave fans the myth they wanted, a man beyond control, but eventually had to learn the hardest lesson of all. Real freedom is not doing anything you want. Real freedom is being able to stop. Number 5, Johnny Cash. Johnny Cash did not need to raise his voice to command a room. He walked in carrying something heavier than celebrity. Presence. The deep baritone. The black clothing. The stillness. The stare that seemed to look through people instead of at them. He became one of the most recognizable figures in American music, larger than country, larger than genre itself. To millions, Johnny Cash represented truth, rebellion, faith, sorrow, and redemption all at once. But for many years, he was also a man losing control. Cash's rise was meteoric. Hit after hit, constant touring, screaming crowds, television appearances, and a schedule that would exhaust almost anyone turned him into a national icon. Yet beneath the success was relentless pressure, emotional emptiness, and the loneliness that often follows fame. Though his struggles with pills became the most famous part of his addiction story, alcohol was deeply woven into the same destructive period. Drinking was not always the headline, but it was often in the room. Late nights on the road, backstage gatherings, hotel isolation, and the endless need to come down after performing created a life where alcohol became normal. It mixed dangerously with amphetamines, sedatives, exhaustion, and emotional instability. For Cash, the bottle was part of a larger war against himself. Some stars use alcohol to celebrate. Others use it to silence pain. Johnny often seemed trapped in the second category. As the 1960s progressed, his life became increasingly chaotic. Missed shows, erratic behavior, arrests, damaged relationships, and career instability followed. He could be brilliant one week and unraveling the next. People around him saw both versions, the kind, thoughtful artist and the man disappearing into addiction. Fame protected him from consequences for a while, but not from damage. His relationship with June Carter Cash became one of the most important turning points in country music history. June loved him fiercely, but she also challenged him. She saw the greatness beneath the self-destruction and refused to romanticize the chaos. Their love story is remembered warmly now, but it was built through years of struggle, setbacks, relapses, and pain. That is what makes Cash's redemption so powerful. Unlike many stars who fade after addiction peaks, Johnny Cash rebuilt. He got healthier, stabilized, reconnected with faith, and returned as something even stronger than a hitmaker, a symbol of survival. Later in life, his music carried a gravity that younger Johnny could never have faked. When he sang about regret, mercy, aging, or judgment, listeners believed every word because they knew what he had been through. His final era introduced him to a new generation. The older man in black, weathered, honest, vulnerable, became as compelling as the young rebel had once been. Still, the scars of earlier years never vanished. Addiction had taken years, relationships, health, and peace that could never fully be recovered. Johnny Cash's story is not about a man who was drunk all the time in the cartoon sense of celebrity excess. It is deeper than that. It is about a man who used every available escape, alcohol included, to outrun pain, then spent the rest of his life trying to face it. Many legends become famous. Very few fall, rise again, and become even greater afterward. Number 4. Moe Bandy. At first glance, Moe Bandy might seem like an unusual name on this list. He was never the wildest outlaw in country music, never the most scandal-ridden headline magnate, and never the kind of star tabloids chased across America. He often appeared steady, likable, and deeply traditional, a classic honky tonk singer with a warm smile and a voice built for heartbreak songs. But sometimes the artists most associated with drinking culture are not the loudest wrecks. Sometimes they are the men who lived inside that world so long it became ordinary. And few artists represented barroom country life like Moe Bandy. Bandy rose in the 1970s, a period when country music still belonged to dance halls, roadside taverns, neon-lit clubs, and smoke-filled rooms where stories ended in tears or another round. His sound was rooted in traditional honky tonk, the style where cheating, loneliness, regret, and whiskey were not side themes. They were the entire emotional universe. Songs about bars felt believable coming from Moe because he sang them like a man who understood every corner of that room. That authenticity mattered. While Nashville gradually moved towards slicker production and crossover polish, Moe Bandy remained tied to old-school country values. His audience loved him because he felt real. He sounded like jukeboxes, last calls, and conversations between broken people too proud to cry. In that environment, alcohol was not shocking. It was cultural background music. And that is why he belongs here. Unlike some names on this countdown, Moe Bandy's story is less about public collapse and more about immersion in a lifestyle where drinking was constant, expected, and normalized. Touring the honky-tonk circuit meant nights ending late, crowds buying drinks, backstage socializing, road exhaustion, and endless access to alcohol. For performers of that era, saying no was often harder than saying yes. The bottle was part of the business model. Many fans forget how physically brutal that circuit could be. Travel, poor sleep, irregular meals, emotional fatigue, and the pressure to entertain no matter how you felt created conditions where alcohol became both reward and coping mechanism. It relaxed nerves before shows, softened loneliness after them, and helped blur the repetition of life on the road. For artists like Moe Bandy, that rhythm could continue for years without attracting scandal headlines because it looked normal from the outside. Yet beneath the easy smile was a working musician carrying the same burdens many stars faced: pressure to stay relevant, constant touring, financial uncertainty, and the emotional wear of living more nights in motels than at home. Still, Bandy endured. That endurance is important. He did not implode publicly. He did not become a cautionary tale defined only by addiction. Instead, he became something rarer. A survivor of an era when countless country performers quietly drank themselves into decline. He kept performing, kept his audience, and remained respected by traditional country fans who saw him as one of the last true honky-tonk voices. Moe Bandy's story reminds us that not every drinking legend ends in arrests, rehab, or front-page scandal. Sometimes it looks calmer than that. Sometimes it is decades of living in a culture where the bottle sits on every table and no one asks questions. He sang the soundtrack of Barroom America because he had lived close enough to know it by heart. 3. Hank Williams. If country music has a ghost, it may be Hank Williams. Long before modern superstardom, branding, or arena tours, Hank Williams created something raw and far more lasting. Emotional truth set to melody. His voice could sound playful, shattered, lonesome, joyful, and doomed, sometimes all within the same performance. In only a few short years, he changed country music forever. Songs like Your Cheatin' Heart, Cold, Cold Heart, and I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry became pillars of American songwriting. But while the world heard genius, the man behind it was unraveling. Hank's rise was meteoric. He became a sensation in the late 1940s, writing and recording with astonishing speed and consistency. Fame arrived fast, but stability never did. He suffered chronic pain from serious spinal problems, emotional instability, intense pressure, and a private life filled with conflict. In that era, medical understanding was limited, addiction treatment was primitive, and stars were expected to keep performing no matter what condition they were in. So Hank did what many broken men of his time did. He self-medicated. Alcohol became a major part of that spiral, mixed with painkillers and other substances. Drinking was not just social for Hank Williams. It became entwined with physical pain, emotional torment, exhaustion, and the brutal demands of constant performance. He could electrify a crowd one night and be barely functional the next. Promoters, bandmates, and industry figures often never knew which version would arrive. As his fame grew, so did the chaos. There were missed shows, public intoxication, professional instability, and behavior that became increasingly hard to manage. Some venues reportedly feared booking him. Others booked him anyway because audiences desperately wanted to see him. That is one of entertainment's oldest tragedies. Talent becomes so valuable that people keep profiting from decline until collapse is unavoidable. His marriage troubles added even more strain. Personal conflict, financial stress, and emotional volatility fed the same cycle already being worsened by alcohol and drugs. Hank was still young, but he was living at a pace that destroys older men. And yet, the music kept coming. That is what makes Hank Williams almost mythical. Amid pain and self-destruction, he continued writing songs of stunning clarity and emotional precision. How someone living in so much disorder could create work so timeless remains one of music history's great mysteries. Perhaps the answer is painful. Sometimes the deepest art comes from people least able to save themselves. In 1953, Hank Williams died at just 29 years old while being driven to a concert. His body had been failing, and years of substance abuse had taken a devastating toll. He was younger than many artists are when they release a first major album. But by then, he had already become immortal. Hank's influence stretches across generations, from traditional country singers to rock artists, Americana writers, and modern songwriters still chasing the emotional honesty he made look effortless. His story is not merely about a man who drank too much. It is about what happens when genius arrives in a fragile vessel. Alcohol did not create Hank Williams' brilliance. It simply helped destroy the body carrying it. Some stars fade slowly. Hank Williams burned so brightly that the flame consumed him before the world was ready to let him go. Number 2, George Jones. If there is one name country music fans expect to see on a list like this, it is George Jones. Not because he lacked greatness, but because he possessed so much of it while nearly destroying himself at the same time. Many singers become famous. A few become legends. George Jones became something even rarer. The artist other country legends openly admired. His voice was so expressive, so emotionally precise, that peers often described him as the greatest pure country singer who ever lived. He could break your heart with a single syllable, and then walk off stage drunk. Jones rose from humble East Texas beginnings and built his career through raw talent, relentless touring, and hit after hit. Songs like He Stopped Loving Her Today would later define country excellence itself. But alongside the music grew another reputation, one almost as famous as the records. George Jones drank heavily, often recklessly, and for years seemed trapped in a cycle of self-sabotage that became industry legend. In country music circles, stories about George were endless. Missed concerts, last-minute cancellations, erratic behavior, explosive moods, nights that blurred into mornings. Promoters frustrated, band members exhausted, loved ones heartbroken. He became so notorious for failing to appear that people joked about whether he would make the show at all. For another artist, that would have ended a career quickly. But George Jones was so gifted, audiences kept forgiving what should have been unforgivable. That is how powerful talent can be, and how dangerous. His marriage to Tammy Wynette became one of country music's most famous unions, and one of its most turbulent. Together, they created unforgettable music, but privately, their relationship was battered by Jones's drinking, instability, and destructive habits. Love can survive many things. Endless addiction is rarely one of them. Then came the story that became folklore. When Tammy reportedly hid the car keys to stop George from going out for alcohol, he allegedly rode a lawnmower several miles to the liquor store. Whether retold perfectly or embellished over time, the tale survived because it captured something true. George Jones's addiction had become almost mythical in scale. Yet beneath the comedy people often attached to those stories was real suffering. Alcohol damaged marriages, finances, friendships, professional trust, and health. It stole years of consistency from a man whose voice should have dominated even more than it already did. Imagine how great George Jones was, and then imagine how much greater he might have been without the bottle. But unlike many tragedies on this list, George eventually fought back. Later in life, he became sober, steadier, and more reflective. He rebuilt parts of his personal life, regained respect professionally, and lived long enough to be celebrated not merely as a cautionary tale, but as a titan. The older George Jones carried humility that the younger man often lacked. Fans who stayed with him saw redemption alongside regret, and through it all, the voice remained sacred. When George Jones sang Heartbreak, People believed him because he had lived enough pain to understand every word. His story is the ultimate country contradiction. The greatest singer in the room was often the least able to control his own life. Alcohol did not define George Jones, but for many years it came frighteningly close. That he escaped it at all may be one of the finest endings country music ever gave anyone. Number 1. Johnny Cash. If George Jones was country music's greatest pure singer, Johnny Cash may have been its greatest symbol. He was more than a star. He was an institution. The black clothing, the deep voice, the prison concerts, the moral gravity, the quiet authority. Johnny Cash became a figure who seemed larger than entertainment itself. To millions, he represented working people, outsiders, sinners, believers, the broken and the redeemed. Few artists in any genre ever carried that kind of meaning, which made his private collapse even more shocking. By the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s, Cash's fame had become enormous. Hit records, constant touring, television appearances, and endless public demand turned him into one of America's busiest entertainers. But fame at that level often creates a dangerous illusion. The stronger the image becomes, the easier it is to hide weakness behind it. Johnny Cash was becoming a giant in public while shrinking in private. Though history often focuses on his pill addiction, alcohol was deeply tied to the same destructive era. The road life of constant motion, late-night adrenaline, emotional isolation, and no real off switch pushed many stars toward drinking. For Cash, alcohol was one more tool used to numb exhaustion, anxiety, emptiness, and the psychological weight of being Johnny Cash every day. The result was chaos. There were arrests, canceled appearances, erratic behavior, fires caused during reckless moments, damaged relationships, and stretches where his career visibly suffered. Friends and colleagues saw a man split in two: brilliant, generous, funny, deeply thoughtful, and also self-destructive, absent, and increasingly difficult to rely on. That duality followed him for years. His marriage collapsed under the strain. Personal life and professional life were both being battered by addiction. Many icons lose balance once. Cash seemed to lose it repeatedly. Then came June Carter Cash. June did not save Johnny Cash in the simplistic fairy tale sense often told later. What she did was far more important. She loved the real man while refusing to worship the broken version of him. She challenged him, steadied him, believed in him, and helped create conditions where recovery became possible. Their relationship became legendary because it was built not on glamour, but on endurance. Cash slowly rebuilt himself. He reconnected with faith, became healthier, regained professional discipline, and entered a later life chapter almost unheard of in music. Instead of fading into nostalgia, he became newly relevant. Older audiences respected him. Younger audiences discovered him. His late recordings carried enormous emotional power because listeners knew he had survived enough suffering to earn every lyric. When he sang about regret, judgment, mercy, or death, it no longer sounded like performance. It sounded like testimony. That is why Johnny Cash sits at number 1. Not because he drank more than everyone else, not because he was the wildest, but because no one else on this list traveled such a complete arc, from icon to collapse to rebirth to immortality. His battle with alcohol was part of a much larger war against pain, identity, addiction, and self-destruction. Many legends die trapped inside their worst years. Johnny Cash lived long enough to outgrow his, and in doing so, he became something even rarer than a legend, a warning and a redemption story at the same time.